We have no staff briefings. City Manager's report. Mr. McGlynn?
Just one thing to report. On Thursday, December 3rd, at 4 p.m., there's going to be a ribbon cutting ceremony for Finale Neighborhood Park, and I'm hopeful that the community will turn out as well as many of the council members will turn out for that dedication ceremony this Thursday.
Great, thank you. Madam City Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wanted to touch on a couple of things. First, I wanted to let you know that the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act was passed and becomes effective on January 1st, 2016. For the city, the important aspect of this ordinance is it requires that a local jurisdiction have in place a zoning ordinance dealing with other medical marijuana businesses. As you know, we currently have an ordinance regarding dispensaries. We do not have a specific ordinance regarding cultivation or transportation businesses. If the city does not have such an ordinance in place, you give up your right to local control to regulate those businesses, and they would only be required to have a state license. There has been some suggestion, I've attended at seminars on this, that this date was not intended to be in there and perhaps might be changed, but currently the law does provide and give us this deadline of March 1st, 2016, which means in order to have a zoning ordinance effective, it would have to go to the Planning Commission and would need to come to the City Council by mid-January in order to be in effect by March 1st. I would like to get some direction from the council. My recommendation would be that you reconvene. We did have a medical marijuana subcommittee to provide some input on those regulations. But in order to do the outreach and to have those discussions and educate you regarding the issues that have arisen with those types of non-regulated businesses at this time, we don't believe it's likely that all of that can be done in place under these timelines. And so after talking with the city manager, the planning department, and others, our suggestion would be that in January we adopt a temporary ban and to allow us time to fully vet the process rather than just adopting some arbitrary regulations. If the council wants to have a discussion about this instead of proceeding in that way, we can certainly schedule this on an upcoming agenda, but my concern is the very limited time that we have. And currently, all of the authorities on this that have been talking about the regulations are concerned that if you don't have something in place, that if you later decide to adopt something, you may have forever given up your right to have local enforcement. And they've also indicated that just having a moratorium under the government code they don't believe is sufficient because that's not considered a zoning ordinance. So because of the way the law is currently regulated, that would be our plan, would be to bring to you in January a temporary ban to allow you to reconvene the subcommittee, meet with the stakeholders, and come up with comprehensive regulation. You may be aware just from reports you received, we have had some issues with fires caused by indoor cultivations. We've had some neighborhood nuisance complaints, and we've also had some robberies associated with grows. So those are some of the impacts that we've seen here locally. And the city manager can also talk to you about in terms of scheduling. So if you do have a concern about that, we can put something on the 15th if you want to have a full discussion about proceeding in a different way.
I think the concern that I have is the timetable as it relates to mandatory check-ins, the repeated direction I've gotten from council about community involvement in these types of conversations moving forward, and the current workload. We're preparing to bring back a revised work plan, which is heavy on getting the housing conversation moved to the forefront of the work plan, and that work plan will be in front of you by the 15th. However, if we are asked to move this to the forefront, I will say it will have an impact on the work plan. What Ms. Fowler said was we were hopeful that we may be in a moratorium conversation. This would be a ban with a date certain to bring back the beginning of September the revised ordinance. So this would be in effect a moratorium, but with the proviso that we would have an ordinance in place. And then we go through a conversation with the subcommittee that would then deliver a revised ordinance by early September. That would then be the vetted, fully discussed, education-driven ordinance for the city to adopt.
Thank you. So, Council, if you have questions this evening, you would have to limit those questions to the state's action because it's not on the agenda to discuss the issues around any ordinance that we might want to talk about. So, are there any questions about the state's action at this point concerning the March 1st deadline? Yeah. Mr. Corsi?
Well, I have a question about what we're talking about here. I don't know whether it meets the guidelines. We're not talking about the state's action. We're talking about taking an action ourselves or directing you to. Tell me what we're talking about, please.
Yes, I'm looking because obviously it's your decision to make how you want to proceed. My recommendation is that we've had a medical marijuana subcommittee, and there are a lot of issues that need to be decided. You know, are you going to regulate these uses in certain parts of the community? Are you going to ban them in residential areas? Are you going to allow them, you know, with a distance from schools? Are you going to limit the number of them you're going to have? Are you going to limit the size of them? Are you going to require burglar alarms? Are you going to limit the amount of electricity? All those, you know, so there's a lot of issues in terms of regulating the business if the decision is that you want to allow those types of businesses in the community. And the planning department, and as the city manager has indicated, we don't believe we can get that with your input together in time to get passed through the planning commission and to you by the middle of January.
I understand that's a big thing to swallow.
So really my first question is,
but what my question is if we don't do that and if we don't do a ban and we can't do this by March 1st, what happens?
Then you give up your right to local control, and they would only be required to have a state license in order to operate one of these businesses.
And that would be without any restrictions at all?
The restrictions would be what's under the state law, that they have to apply for a state license and they have to meet certain requirements. But in terms of land use locations, they would not be limited. So you would be giving up your right, like any other type of land use regulation, to limit where those types of business operations could locate.
And the state law does not include any particular restrictions on where these activities can take place?
No. It's also somewhat frustrating because the state has already said that they don't envision that they actually will be granting the licenses till 2018. So it's somewhat challenging to understand why we have to have something in place by March 1st when they won't even be issuing. But they are giving priority to businesses that are in compliance with local regulations. And of course, you know, our suggestion would be if there was a ban, that we would be making an exemption for personal cultivation, which is not regulated by the state. There's an exception that you don't have to have a state license for certain limited amount for personal cultivation.
Do we expect that a ban would cause any change in the activities that are happening currently?
Not the ones that we know about. You know, under our current zoning ordinance, we have what's called permissive zoning, and you're authorized to conduct certain types of businesses that are permitted by code. We currently don't permit cultivating and manufacturing type businesses. We do permit dispensaries under our dispensary ordinance, which currently is limited to 2 businesses. There may be businesses that are operating that we are not aware of. And maybe we would have some ability, but the council could certainly direct during this interim period that you don't want code enforcement out there heavily regulating unless there were concerns. I mean, I think the goal of staff is not to go out and start shutting down businesses, but is to preserve your right to local control so that you can make whatever regulations you deem appropriate for those businesses and not lose the right to do that.
Mr. Mayor, do we have people who want to speak to this from the public?
Do.
Thank you.
But I also have a couple of, Council, would you prefer to have your questions answered now or wait until public comment? Mr. Vice Mayor? Okay. Sure, Mr. Wysocki.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you for the update, Madam City Attorney. You mentioned all of the authorities you referred. Could you elaborate on what authorities we're talking about?
Sure. So far, the League of California Cities and the California State Bar have both put on continuing education seminars with attorneys who have specialized in current issues and been before the court on medical marijuana regulation and the decisions that have been brought forth in the court so far.
But nothing from the no elaboration from the legislature.
Usually the legislature doesn't elaborate very much other than
No, I
what they
understand that, but I mean, you had mentioned there was some speculation that the March 1st might be.
Yeah, it's my understanding that Assemblymember Wood, who was, this legislation was the culmination of three different bills, one AB 266, AB 243, which was Assemblymember Wood's, and SB 643, which was McGuire's bill. Assemblyman Wood has said apparently in a letter, which I have not seen, but that was written to a publication, that there were some changes that he was hoping to make to the legislation, that there were things that he thought ought to have been changed in what was finally adopted. But I can't speculate as to what they may do, only tell you what the current state of the law is.
That's fine. Thank you. I appreciate the answer. On the licensing aspect, for brevity, you just mentioned, I'm assuming you just mentioned transportation and cultivation, but not testing or distribution or manufacturing. It would be everything under that would be. Is that correct?
Right. So under the law, you have an ability to regulate transportation if you want, not through the city, but if you wanted to, for example, ban deliveries, so a dispensary from another community delivering to residents of Santa Rosa. I think we haven't had a big issue with that, and I don't see that currently that's a problem. I think the bigger issue for us is locating of businesses that are cultivating or manufacturing. But you could also include that within the scope of whatever ban you want if you want to preserve your rights on that issue as well.
Thank you. And then as to the medical marijuana subcommittee, what would be the time frame for this? I mean, I'm happy to serve again on it, but I'd like to get a sense of the work plan for that committee and when we might have a product ready so that we're not just...
Yeah, I think after, as Mr. McGlynn said, after talking with the various departments that would be involved, we think there would be several meetings of the subcommittee with interested members of the community and that business purview, similar to what we did when we updated the dispensary ordinance. And so that would be a process of several months of meetings with stakeholders in the committee, and then it would require several months for the staff to prepare the ordinance. So Mr. McGlynn had suggested that if we come forward with a ban, that it be till September 1st. Certainly it could terminate sooner if the product can come forward sooner.
So it sounds more like a moratorium as opposed to a ban.
Essentially, it's a moratorium, but what the attorneys who practice in this field have said is that because the language of the statute specifically says it has to be a zoning ordinance, a moratorium is not considered a zoning ordinance. So it would be a provision in the zoning code that temporarily bans. We're not intending to permanently ban.
Okay, no, that's fine. I may have more questions after public comment. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Ms. Karlstrom.
I only have one clarifying question right now. Since we already have an ordinance with respect to dispensaries, the temporary moratorium would not impact that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Council, if you're okay if you're waiting with your other questions, I'll move on to public comment. Jacqueline McGowan. Is she in the chamber? She's not here. Tony Logan. Welcome.
Hello, good evening, Mayor Sawyer and council members. I'm Tawny Logan. I'm the Executive Director of the Sonoma County Growers Alliance. We represent a collection of over 200 medical marijuana cultivators and advocates. We're here today to thank you for the steps that you've taken in recent years to make sure that that Santa Rosa has been a patient-friendly city through your Medical Cannabis Ad Hoc Committee, and to encourage you to embrace the opportunities presented to you through the passage of the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. Santa Rosa is a unique place with a unique position of esteem and respect within the medical marijuana industry. You may not know it, but industry leaders from across the country look to the leadership of businesses right here in your own city limits. The new state regulations afford Santa Rosa the opportunity to embrace and enhance that estimation, as well as continue leadership in patients' access. The regulations are robust and present a regulatory scheme that we are sure was unanticipated and potentially unwelcome by city staff. We understand the pressures imposed by the March 1st deadline, and we're here to work with your staff and the council to create an ordinance and permitting structure that limits the burden on your staff while maximizing safety, revenue, and patient access opportunities. The simple fact is that a ban, even if it's temporary, will turn your local citizens into criminals overnight. Sorry. We're certain that with some creativity, the city can implement certain aspects of the regulation's potential well in advance of that deadline, while ensuring the public safety, environmental protection, and creating a pathway for responsible economic involvement that is good for us all. We request that the City of Santa Rosa Cannabis Subcommittee be reconvened and that stakeholders be invited to participate in the crafting of the work plan of the ordinance. We do not seek an unregulated cultivation as well in your community. We do want to be involved in the creation of local regulations that enable us to retain local control by creating these local regulations prior to March 1st. We are, and we want to, continue to be good stewards of our community, and we stand ready to work collaboratively with the City of Santa Rosa for the best outcome for all residents, patients, and cultivators.
Thank you. Linda Kelly?
Is this on? Hi. Linda Kelly, Sebastopol. I was on the City Council when we created the dispensary ordinance and then revised it for cultivation. And I've just direct you towards that. I didn't understand for tonight's meeting, because there wasn't really a staff report, that personal cultivation for patients was not going to be in this ban, and I want to applaud you for that, because there seems to be a lot of jurisdictions that are very concerned about that issue, but you can create an ordinance similar to Sebastopol that honors the security of the neighborhood, and that's a major concern, and also honoring the patient's rights to grow their own personal medicine in a limited fashion and in a way that's respectful of neighborhoods as well. And as far as I've known, we've had our ordinance for personal cultivation maybe 6 years or so. I'm sorry, I don't know the date, and I haven't heard of any problems. And we do put on our website at the beginning of the season what the rules are in Sebastopol. And so doesn't mean everyone reads it or their water bill insert, but it's there, and so far we've done okay. I do understand the issue around safety from lights and other apparatus. So if you look at our ordinance, you can see that we addressed all of that. And seems like other folks look at our ordinance as well. Good luck with working this through. Sebastopol is as well going to be looking at our ordinance and trying to bring it into compliance with the state ahead of time, but do as minimal as possible. So as long as you have an ordinance, your zoning ordinance, even when you're talking about commercial cultivation and all the different strata of the business, you can change it later. So I say minimal is best, just to meet the requirements. You've got your ordinance in place, and then you can move forward and change it if your subcommittee comes back together. So I'm currently on the Planning Commission in Sebastopol. I didn't say that, but I'm not representing any of that. So good luck.
Thank you. Those are all the cards I have on this item. Bring it back to the council. So, Mr. Vice Mayor, you had a question.
question and comments. I do support the recommendation and keeping the local control because I do think it's rather complex. Those three bills, it is rather complex, and before we make a long-term decision, I would like to have more information. I do agree that reconvening the subcommittee would be a good idea. I used to participate on that in another role, so I think that vetting a lot of the different options out there, I think, is a good idea. And again, as City Manager McGlynn said earlier tonight, getting that community involvement to make sure we're making the best decisions in the interest of the city. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Wysocki, you had further questions?
I did, thank you. What would be the provisions for an emergency ordinance? I know you had mentioned that a regular ordinance has to go through, a zoning ordinance has to go through a planning commission and then come to the council, and then there's a second reading. So is there a way where we could speed that? Should we?
Yeah, an urgency ordinance would not require second reading. As I said, in order for something to be in effect by March 1st, under normal circumstances, you'd have to have 2 readings and 30 days before it comes effective. There's been some dispute about urgency ordinance. One could make an argument that the deadline in the state law creates an urgency, but urgency ordinances are only effective for a certain period of time and require a supermajority vote of the city council. So our recommendation was that the safest course of action would be to proceed. Obviously, I understand that the council is not interested in having a long-term ban, and that's but we just didn't want to come forward with some arbitrary rules with sort of a take it or leave it situation for you. We wanted you to have the input and the stakeholders to have the input, and certainly, our goal would be to bring it forward as quickly as possible, given the other work that's available.
And I appreciate that. I just think that either way we're being arbitrary, and the comments that to do it quickly, absolutely one way would make perhaps criminals of some law-abiding citizens that otherwise would be allowable under state law. That was my point. So,
well, and again, I think the direction for us not to engage with to be respectful of existing business operations, but with the understanding that if there are existing business operations, then you're eventually going to make some decisions about land use that it may be a conversation that we need to get into. So I think there's a way to balance those concerns. Again, my preference would have been brought forward as a moratorium as opposed to a ban, but because of the issue about local control and the education that was brought to me by the city attorney, we don't want to lose that local control issue, and so that was why this, and I think you've termed it right, Councilmember Wysocki, is that the attempt here is to get into a full conversation, but live up to make sure that we're protecting the city's interest in the land use arena.
I appreciate that. One more question I neglected to ask. Manufacturing of food products. Would that already be covered under existing zoning regulation?
It would depend. I mean, some of I've received a couple of inquiries where some manufacturing businesses also want to have a component where they're doing research and development, where they're actually having cultivation as part of the business. I think when someone said they're in the food manufacturing business, I don't think necessarily our planning staff asks, what are you putting in the food? So it may be that those types of businesses do exist.
Ms. Carlston.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't even know where to, well, I do. If we did implement a ban/moratorium, like we're talking about, what activities specifically are we banning? Because we're carving out dispensaries. We already have an ordinance there.
Right. So it would primarily be cultivation of more beyond the amounts that are exempted for personal cultivation. It's primarily, and like I said, if there was a desire, we could include the transportation. But again, I'm not seeing that we're having issues with transportation, and that's also much more challenging and really not so much a land use issue in terms of locations and complaints from neighbors.
So it would not address, as Councilmember Wysocki asked about, the manufacturing, distribution, transportation, testing, all of the other ancillary activities that are called for under the regulations.
Except to the extent that there's some other type of business going on there, and, if the council chooses at some point to regulate that.
I'm sorry, what?
The ban is intending to address just cultivation.
Okay. So cultivation for personal use, potentially done in support of a dispensary or a collective that's already operating, is not going to be impacted by this ban/moratorium.
If they fall within the exemption as
Right.
carved out under the state law, yes.
Okay. And I believe I heard you mention that we could direct that this conversation come back in January for a fuller conversation as opposed to just a conversation about a ban.
If you want to have a fuller discussion about some other way to go about doing this, my recommendation would be to put it on the December 15th meeting, because the clock is ticking, and like I said, to really get something in place, it has to have the first reading by the middle of January, and it also has to go to the Planning Commission, and to get on the Planning Commission for the first meeting in January means the staff report has to be done by the end of December.
Yeah.
There will be no public input process. I will put it on the record right now. If that is even with a reading on the 15th, laying out the calendar the way it is, if you're going to go through, there's going to be no way for us to reach a public input process. It will be in each of these chambers. That will be the only public input process.
So I want to make sure I understood. December 15th, you're proposing for a first reading?
No, if you wanted to have a discussion about proceeding in a different way than I've outlined, reconvening the subcommittee and studying this and protecting our rights in the meantime. For example, if you wanted me to just go out and take Sebastopol's ordinance and just adopt that without looking at it, without any education, that's another option. So if you want to discuss other options, then direct me to put this on an agenda for your next, we can't get it on for the 8th, but we could put it on for the 15th if you want to explore. But I think you really sort of need to make a decision about how to move forward, not necessarily content-wise, but how we're going to move forward because of the deadline. And
No, and I appreciate that. And Mr. McGlynn and City Attorney Fowler have made very clear that there is a lot of constraints on your time based on the workload that we've created for you, and I appreciate that. I also respect that this is a unique position. Timelines imposed on us by the state that we had no control over, really. Mr. Mayor, I'm sure you're looking for input from everybody, but I would love to see this come back to us for a fuller discussion on the 15th, and I would also put my support behind reconvening the subcommittee to engage in that fuller background conversation.
Well, let me ask a couple of clarifying questions, because my assumption was the subcommittee would take on the work of deciding, having conversations in that group about the scope of the moratorium / ban, and then those recommendations they would discuss as a ad hoc subcommittee and come back to the council with a recommendation.
yes, the thought was they would discuss what type of regulations. We want it to be 500 feet from schools. We only want so many. We want to limit the size. We want to put whatever other, whether it should be a conditional use permit, whether it needs to go to the Planning Commission, whether it can be over the counter, all those types of issues.
I think what the city attorney was recommending was this was a way to get us into a level of compliance as of right now. I don't think the subcommittee would have time, frankly, to have a full conversation about the extent of the ban. This is what the direction is today. If council wants us to take a different approach on the 15th of December, we can bring back other options to say these are other ways we can handle this. On the 15th as well, as part of your of the agenda for informational purposes, we're going to be publishing a revised work plan, which will have all of the work that we've been assigned around housing and other issues that we're wrestling with. And this does, because of the way it impacts a variety of departments, if we're called into action, and there's some things that we would do as bare minimum in this conversation, or will require me to reassign resources to address this, to get you an ordinance in the time that we're talking about that would even adopting something like Sebastopol's ordinance, which would require us making sure that we're devoting staff resource to that. That's why we're asking for direction tonight is, are you comfortable with the city attorney's plan? Do you want us to do something slightly different that will have impacts on how we complete other work assigned to us? What we do know, we don't know what's going to happen on the state level. I think, as you heard from the city attorney, there is some surprise that this is causing some issues at the local level, as is typical with some assignments from the state level, is they don't really understand the issues that creates when implementation comes around. That was the reason why at one point we were thinking about just going with a moratorium. Again, this allows us to preserve our land use issues, commit to having a full conversation and bringing back a revised ordinance that would reflect the desires and needs of the council and the community by September 1. So that was the proposal that was laid out. If you want to change that again what I'm just reiterating is that's when we can bring it back without impacting the work we're trying to do right now. If we change that, then I'm going to have to look at the work plan and figure out how I devote resources to get you a delivery by March 1st, which is a really, really tight time frame to deliver an ordinance of any magnitude in that time frame. So I would say the subcommittee proposal was to work on the larger ordinance, primarily work on the ordinance for the September 1 date. That was the proposal under consideration. They would convene before then and could have some input on the interim ordinance or the ban, but the real work was going to be on the full ordinance that we were going to bring back later on.
Including public input.
Including public input.
To a much higher level. Yes. Thank you. Mr. Wysocki.
I appreciate the explanation. It does concern me that no public input, should we want to keep it in front of the council to make this March 1 date. I would still like to explore, though, the card that we don't want to play or that I don't want to play. I don't want to play an arbitrary ban just to preserve rights. I mean, it seems to be that we're doing that because we have to. And I understand that. We're being forced into that. But why can't that card be played as an urgency ordinance should the state legislature not change? Because I'd rather see the subcommittee go forward, get the public input, not take staff resources away from housing and other council priorities, and then if we have to, we do the urgency ban while the subcommittee is still moving forward.
Yeah, there is a risk with that. You can certainly do that. It's more risky than having a regular ordinance, because some people can question the urgency of the urgency, which could invalidate the ordinance. And it, as I said, also requires a 5/7 vote to pass the urgency ordinance.
Correct. No, that I understand, the 5/7. I mean, to me, urgency has to do with time. And it's inherent in this legislation that there's a time requirement, but I'm not the attorney, so...
I mean, I think what we're saying is that if you got to that point and you adopted an urgency, you went forward with an urgency ordinance and you didn't meet the threshold, it's potential that we could be in a situation where you're not agreeing about that particular item. So that is, again, that is a risk to take if you want to take that direction. I mean, our intent is to start to work on this as soon as possible if the subcommittee is reconvened.
I appreciate that. I'm listening.
So what I hear you saying is that if we were to wait, one could argue, had you taken action in December, you wouldn't have this urgency issue. So it's your fault, therefore it's not urgent, therefore it could be questioned. I'll just chime in. I'm not uncomfortable with, well, first of all, how quickly would the ban need to be acted on?
Again, what the law requires is that it be in effect by March 1st. So in order to adopt something, it has to have a first and a second reading.
Okay. So what I would propose is that we reestablish the original ad hoc subcommittee, which, if they are willing to serve on it, consisted of Mr. Wysocki, Ms. Carlstrom, and Mr. Oliveris, to come together with recommendations to the council regarding the ban and be able to start the conversations with the community as well, subsequent to March 1st. So I am comfortable with that. I don't, just because we put a ban in place does not mean that that this is going to languish on the desks in City Hall.
The only point of emphasis I want to make in this is that, I just want to make sure it's clear that if that's the direction we're taking, the longer work still will be taking place after the first of the year, not immediately commencing in December.
Yes.
About the ordinance, because again, I have issues about staff resource allocation, and if I immediately get pulled into a conversation that's about creating a brand new ordinance between now and March 1st, I just want to make sure that's clear, and my understanding is clear that the real work on the ordinance is going to be taking place over a period of 6 months.
Yes, and that
the public input.
And that the ban creates breathing room for the community and the council. Mr. Wysocki.
Thank you. I apologize to my colleagues for another question, but the thought just occurred to me. I haven't read the actual state statute. Is the ban needs to be in effect on March 1st? Does it have to be in continuous effect after that date?
They haven't specifically said. What they said is you have to have a zoning ordinance in place effective March 1st. So you can't just introduce it on March 1st. It has to be operative on March 1st. I don't know. It hasn't specified what the impact would be if you later, on April 1st repealed it. Our plan would be to repeal it as soon as we have something to replace it with. The concern is that you just not jeopardize your right to have local licensing, because what the state law says is you require 2 licenses, a local license and a state license. Right. If a community opts to ban, which communities can, but I don't think that's where we would go in Santa Rosa, then you can't get a state license. If a local jurisdiction chooses not to regulate, then you only need a state license. So as the city manager said, and as I indicated, what we're trying to do is preserve our right to require local licensing and the conditions for land use. And
I appreciate that. I'm just trying to help citizens be in compliance with law and for their daily activities.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
Just for the city manager, for point of clarification, we do have an opportunity for when we do the council goal setting, which is currently scheduled for February of 2016. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So at that point, we could also agendize topics as we're reprioritizing our work plan from 2015 into 2016. And if this council chose to do so, bump up this item at a higher priority, which may change that September date, we would have that ability. Is that correct?
Well, I think you will. I think the focus of that is going to be on visioning on where you want to go with the city in the next 5 years. So I don't know that we're going to spend this sort of detailed work on projects as we were before, but obviously as you talk about big themes and big directions and visions where you want to take the city, that plays into this conversation. Again, we're committed to getting something in front of you as quickly as we can. We do know there's moving parts in Sacramento that might impact the March 1st date, but right now those are unknown, and whether those are going to come to fruition. Right now the only deadline we have is March 1st, and it does impact local control.
Certainly if there was a change, if prior to bringing the ordinance to you, the state changed that, then we'd just let you know that we're not coming forward with a ban because they've moved the date.
Right. And I appreciate, I do appreciate your comments from the city manager about the priorities, because I know we ask a lot, and eventually there is staff capacity. And so this is one of those reality checks saying, where's it going to go? So again, as I said earlier, I appreciate our current priorities, and I appreciate the timeline that's set forward that I could support.
Mr. Corsi.
Thank you. I see this as well, it's a hugely important issue. We're talking about, we're predicating this discussion on big changes in the way that we treat cannabis in this state and in this community. It's important that we get it right. I don't want to see us doing that on the fly. And, I understand that people would rather that we do this quickly and without having to have a ban or a moratorium or whatever the term is we're going to call it. But, every industry that is regulated, whether it's the real estate industry or the wine industry or the building industry or the taxi cab industry, would rather not be regulated. And every industry would like us to do things faster than we do. I want to see us do this right. Personally, I support legalization of cannabis. I want to see it happen, but I want to see it done right, and I'm willing to take the time to do it right.
Thank you, Ms. Karlstrom.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I want to clarify a couple things. We're not voting on a ban right now.
No.
When would a potential moratorium be coming back to us?
Mid-January.
And does it have to come back in January?
Yes. Unless
For
there's,
the process and the reading and everything in advance of March 1st?
right, unless there was some change between now and then in the state law. So if, by the end of this year there was some change in the state law, then obviously that would eliminate the need to do it then. But first it would need to go to the Planning Commission, and then we would bring it forward with their recommendations. So my thought is, as the city manager said, that if this direction you can support, then we could reconvene the subcommittee, have you look at the proposed ban that we will be bringing forward in January, and offer any comments that you have and allow public input into that process, so that you can provide that input to the rest of the council when we bring it forward in mid-January.
Okay, so the subcommittee would be quickly reconvened.
You could have one quick meeting to look at, because it's going to be a very short essential ordinance that would just basically say, except for personal cultivation, it's temporarily banned, and then
Cultivation is banned.
Yes, and if the subcommittee wanted to expand into those other areas, you can certainly have that discussion.
Okay. This is a very complex issue, and I know this was just supposed to be like a report from you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I will serve on the committee. I know I'm not sure if you'd called for that, but. I just want us to make sure that we're not sending a signal to the industry as a whole. We heard from a speaker tonight, Santa Rosa plays a role. And if we're just talking about limiting one type of activity, what signal does that send to the people doing business in the city, but also to staff maybe that are receiving permit applications? I mean, what is our interim ethos, if you will? If somebody comes to you, Sean, and says, I want to open a dispensary. I mean, we're not banning it because it's already allowed. So that would be left to you, I suppose, to provide direction to your staff that this is a limited conversation.
It is a limited conversation, but it's about, as was mentioned before, it is about the direction that we're going, and ultimately making sure that everyone gets educated and understands that direction as well. And so it will have an impact. I won't, that's where you get into a situation where you're asking for a moratorium, a ban, is actually to get together, to have a full conversation, to bring the community together and get it right the first time. And so that is the attempt. I think what happens often in other ways is that folks feel outside of the conversation and get very confused by the conversation. And I'll be honest, I'm having some of that. Just the conversation about this, I think, is causing some anxiety in other parts of the community, because it is what exactly is going on, what's going to happen. I think the ultimate, some of the ultimate decisions on referendums that might be coming down the line are adding to that, and this becomes a way to get into a conversation to prepare the community for where we are, what's going on, what's allowable, and we have to do a better job of that. And unfortunately, as I said before, sometimes the state sets a deadline, and then we're all scrambling to react to that deadline. And even then, and in this case, I think they weren't 100% sure. And it's about a balancing of priorities. We're fully willing to change the priority. I just want to be honest about right now what has been messaged to the staff about where priority lies. And if we elevate this to the top, other things are going to fall down the priority list. And so that's always a tough conversation to have. And right now, that's why we came with a proposal that we felt we could manage to have a constructive conversation with the community and come out with a well thought out ordinance at the end, not necessarily as an interim space.
I understand that, and again, I'm the first among many of us to call for and ask for and demand public input and involvement and a lengthy and robust public conversation. So I appreciate your emphasis on that. It's a very interesting place we find ourselves because the industry has that January 1st deadline. And so as Councilmember Schwedhelm, or excuse me, Vice Mayor Schwedhelm asks, where does it go? Well, the business goes elsewhere. So in the interim, we're going to have tax revenue leakage. So it's something to be aware of. We had that conversation when the subcommittee was convened the first time. We were losing it to communities right next door, and we're going to lose it to Windsor, and we're going to lose it to Petaluma. So it's something to be aware of because it's revenue that might fund some of those other priorities. And that's not the chief concern. It's just an aspect to be reminded about. So.
And each of those communities are going to have the same conversation we're having unless they already have those kind of ordinances in effect.
Mr. Wysocki.
Thank you. And I do appreciate this conversation, and I do appreciate the community, the folks that are out here. I don't believe Katati has quite that ordinance yet, but I'm looking at a former mayor up there, and maybe they will soon. I appreciate the need for public input, and that's why I'm willing to follow staff's recommendation on this. I have followed this issue. Our State Board of Equalization representative, Fiona Ma, has been holding some webcasts on this, and there was just one on transport of cannabis. But the one gem that came from that I want to pass to my colleagues is that the last industry to be regulated in the state of California was the timber industry, and it took 10 years to write those regulations. So the point of doing it right is a good one. So as long as we are sending consistent signals that we want to get it right and we do want to cooperate with the industry, I'm fine with the route that staff has laid out. I'm more than willing to serve at the mayor's pleasure and hopefully go forward, although should there be some changes at the state level, I think we could adapt to those, and should we decide that we wanted to go with an urgency ordinance, we could explore that, but I don't want to get caught up on semantics. I want to do this correctly.
Mr. Olivares.
Thank you, Mayor. I think taking everything into consideration, I do believe that the city attorney's recommendation is the prudent way to go. I think the message is that we are listening and that we will do this right, and I will also volunteer to continue my service on the committee as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, then, in the spirit of thoughtful governance, we will reconvene our council subcommittee with a meeting that will be agreed upon with you and the city attorney and whomever else in staff needs to be there, and they will schedule a meeting as soon as possible.
Thank you. And then the last part of my report, I just want to remind the council that after tomorrow, I will be out on medical leave, as I've previously indicated to you, and I already have another attorney that's working on the medical marijuana issues with me, so he'll be able to attend the subcommittee meeting if I'm not back in time for when you have the first of those, but certainly will be there for the rest of them.
Thank you. And thank you, council, for your willingness to serve again.